Imagine what it'd be like if we were really curious about each other.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Relational Spirituality, the weekly podcast of largerstory.com, the podcast that sees all relationships as spiritual and all spiritual formation as relational. Now, here's your host for this week, Kep Crab.
Welcome, everyone, to Relational Spirituality, a larger story podcast where you belong, you become, and you can be known in the story that's going on right now. I'm your host today, Kep Crab, and this quarter, Relational Spirituality will be focused on the themes and the thoughts from the book SOULTAK, a book written in 2003, and a book used by many counselors over the years as kind of a roadmap to having rich, deep conversations that matter. And if you don't have a copy of SOULTAK now, go to largerstory.com and order one today. So as we dive into our discussion today, I've got some special people that are joining me. I've got Roseanne Moore, who many of you know. She also hosts a podcast on relational spirituality. She's a colleague of mine, and she's actually recovering from emergency appendectomy surgery a few weeks ago. So I'm grateful that she's joining us today and has the strength. So thank you, Roseanne, for joining us today for sure. And our guests today, two guys who are both very special to me. Both are seasoned counselors, who are now looking back on years of talking with people about their lives. And I spent this past weekend with one of these gentlemen who is in a part of the small group that my wife and I are part of. And we've been part of this group for the last year and a half. And this was the first time that we got to gather together. And it was super fun. And the spirit was hovering over the weekend, as we say, and we're just hoping that happens in our conversation today. The other guest that's going to be joining us today is also a close friend of my family's. He's a counselor, and he's been part of a small group with my folks for, Tom, has it been 2 decades? How long was that group, Ro?
Yeah, we started about 2001. So it was about 20 years when Larry was still alive. Yep.
So the better part of 2 decades for sure. And I just want to say to everyone watching today that these two guys don't know each other. They've not met. But they're really cut out of the same cloth. And I'm super excited to have them both joining us today. So welcome Brian Fast and Tom Board to our discussion today. Guys, thanks for joining us.
Me too.
Well, this is going to be fun. We have been super excited about having you two join us. So let's just start today with a couple of quick questions. The first question is give us a little bit of your counseling background. How long you've been involved in counseling, where you started, where you are now, some of those kind of things, just some background on each of you. And then the second question to this is, how has Larry Crab's influence played into some of the counseling that you guys have been a part of for the last few years? Tom, why don't you go first?
Sure, glad to. It's an interesting story. I started in college as a civil engineer and never practiced. I graduated as a civil engineer, but the Navigators, a Christian organization, asked me to come on staff, and I was on staff with them for 15 years, working with college students. And through a series of events, my life kind of fell apart. And the joke in my family is I spent $10,000 on my marriage and just happened to get a counseling degree. I went to Grace Theological Seminary, where I met, Danny Allender and Larry Crab, and I went there just to kind of save my marriage and ended up being a counselor. So it's a kind of a strange beginning where I was out of 54 students. I was one of the few that had no intention of being a counselor, but those guys actually saw something in me and asked me to stay on. And I moved out here to Colorado when they moved out. So I've been counseling since about 1989. And I would say for the first 10 years or so, 10, 12 years, most of my counseling experience was based out of what I had learned from Larry during the counseling program. And it really was, there's a lot of fundamental things that were the same, but things kind of changed with Larry in around the 2000 era, where he began to really ponder the Trinity and how that affects relationality and how you actually chat with people. So for me, it wasn't like I was distant from understanding Larry's thinking, because it was kind of all formative in there. But somewhere around the early 2000s, when I started meeting with him in a spiritual formation group, I went to an SSD. I began to really contemplate that the way I was sitting with people really needed to change. And I was beginning to experience that where I could sit with somebody and out of my sheer competency, which sadly I have a lot of it, I could depend on my competency and
Yeah.
not the spirit to sit with somebody and they would feel very ministered to. But I really felt there was something missing as I was sitting with people. And I think through, Larry's talks, going through SSD, I began to kind of notice that there might be a different way for me to sit with people. And I made a commitment. I remember very clearly, I was at Glen Erie where I made a commitment. So I've been a counselor for 10 or 12 years. I made a commitment. I'm going to try to go a different way with people. And it was very difficult. I lost 9 clients in the first month because the direction I was going was not the way that they thought counseling should look. And so it has been a long journey over the last 20 years to begin to realize that I really, and from my heart, really want to go a different way. And I would say that it's had a major impact in both my comfortability as far as what I do, and at other times, the confusion that I feel with I sit with people, because frankly, if you're really kind of leaning on the spirit, there are times you really have no clue what to say. And for a competent guy, I hate that. I want to know something to say. I want to be able to go some direction and to really surrender that and say, no, I can't go that way. So it's really had a pretty big impact.
That was the first question that came to my mind. Like for an engineer, I would
Yeah.
think you're pretty precise. You like things a certain way, or you would have approached life that way early on. It sounds like you've made a big shift in being willing to open your hands and not have to have things that way. Is that
Roseanne, the program kind of blew me up. The best way. I mean, I was literally a mess for 12 months.
uh-huh.
And I think that's one of the reasons they liked me is that I was willing to be a mess because there was a reason why precision and, non-relating, if you had talked to any of the people that I was a staff trainer for the navigators in the Midwest region, none of them would have come to me if they had deep issues because I just wouldn't go there. And what I didn't know was that there's a lot of story to my life that was kind of locked inside. And that came out in that 12 months. And that really exposed me to there's a depth to me that I had no idea I had. And that really changed my whole life. It's not that any of the past is gone. I could probably still do all that kind of, ministry that I'd done, but I found a deeper passion in me that kind of led me on a different trajectory. So that's a great observation. It's really true. My wife would say, he was a man that I could hardly recognize after 2 years.
Wow.
Wow.
In a good way.
In a good way. That's right.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. And she would know
She
more
would
than
know.
anybody. Yes.
That's correct.
Oh, well, so that has me. Okay. I don't know where we want to go with this, Cap. I don't want to take over, but that has me curious, but I don't want to shut Brian out of the conversation.
Oh, fine. I'm happy to connect this way too.
No, this is fun. I want to introduce Brian though. Brian is part of our small group. He and his wife Jean were just with our group, and we've got several couples and a widow in there, and the widow is blind, and she's just the sweetest gal on the planet. And Brian and Jean stayed with her this weekend, and we just all had a chance to get together and fellowship and eat a lot and talk a lot about some good things. And so Brian's become a real special friend of mine. And Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe some of the crab influence on your counseling, perhaps.
Yeah, sure. My original interest in psychology came with some observations my mother had of me that in junior high and high school, people would gravitate to me to have conversations. And it was usually their problem bringing the conversation, initiating the conversation, and I would listen and they would leave kind of feeling helped. And I really didn't notice that, but she noticed that and encouraged me to pursue psychology. And I went to a secular undergraduate school and really didn't like psychology and decided I would like to get into maybe becoming a pastor, I went to a Bible school for a year and then very much felt called to apply to the Biola graduate school, which was Rosemead Graduate School of Psychology at Biola University. And that was a pretty clinical, purist sort of program. We learned to be psychotherapists, and they would even um, look with a critical eye on you if you wanted to start a session in prayer. That wouldn't be uh, really welcome, uh, at least at the time. But
Even at Biola.
yeah, it's not clean psychotherapy. It could influence the client in one way or another, and introduce too much into the relationship that's from you, from the therapist. I I I started that way, and gradually over years, viewed myself as on a journey from being a clinical psychotherapist to being a pastoral counselor. That's the way I thought of myself when I started to read and hear uh, your dad's books and talks. Um, I went to a pre-conference that Larry did called An Evangelical Approach to Spiritual Direction at a American Association for Christian Counselors conference. And I was really, really drawn to what he had to say. Learned for the first time about SSDs and next steps and signed up right away. And Tom, I didn't know that my marriage was a mess until I got to SSD and started to have some influence from the spiritual director that worked with me, and then my life blew up, and it was actually a great help to see how selfish and self-centered I was, and I continue to struggle with that as a man, as a person, as a husband. Um, but it was the first real experience of my need for grace and being grateful for grace. I didn't think I needed much forgiveness before then. I thought I was a pretty snazzy guy. My wife was lucky to have me, and wow, I'm embarrassed to say it, but I'm used to saying it now. It's quite a perspective shift. Um, One thing I'll mention just about my graduate training, we were mandated to have a year of group psychotherapy and a year of individual psychotherapy. First, we had the group, and then we had the individual. And I think they got it backwards. In retrospect, because of how Larry taught about the Trinity and community, and soul talk and what we're talking about now. I am convinced that maturity has to do with how we relate to other people, how we put God on display by the way we relate to one another in community. And I think it would have been great to have individual therapy to get to see what some of my issues were, and then from a more mature place, start to relate and practice and experiment with relating different in community. But that's what we're doing in small group. That kept mentioned that we're in the same small group. Tom, I think it's really cool that you were in Larry's small group and I get to be in Larry's son's small group, and we're practicing community together.
It's so special.
So I'm curious for both of you then, how has learning to engage your own story, like Tom was talking about, um, and seeing God meet you in your story and shape you as you've been willing to do that, as you've been willing to engage your own heart and your own story, how has that changed perhaps how you're ministering to other people, how you're counseling, how you're relating to, you talked about both of you about your marriages. Um, what how has that shaped you?
Well, I'll start off. I don't mean to do that each time, but I'm glad to. I think, one of the things that Larry talks about in Soul Talk, and again, it's been so long since I read that, but I know that one of the elements that he puts words to is the idea of passion, what's going on inside of you, and the idea that the other one is thinking beneath. And I think that, and I was talking to someone this morning, is the reason that I feel so comfortable talking with people is I don't feel distant from them and their messed upness. I know my fallen nature is very real and very active in getting in the way all the time of my listening to people and my actually pondering what the spirit might be doing. And until there's some level of awareness and repentance on my part, as far as what's going on inside of me, I really can't hear people very well. And, I can go through a day and I can have a session where I am super engaged with what's going on inside of me and engaged with it. And I can have another session the same day where I'm just lost in my head. I'm thinking about lunch. I'm thinking about, what am I going to do? And then when I get home, I mean, I'm all over the place and I have to constantly be repenting just to kind of stay focused on somebody. And so I think that really has had an impact on really understanding what does it take to be present with somebody, to really be there for somebody else. It is an internal journey to actually journey well with them. And I think that's one of the ways that's really impacted me is just being a lot more conscious of what's going on in me at the same time listening to them.
And when you were talking about Soul Talk, the think beneath and think vision and think passion and think story, all of the themes from Soul Talk, how they play into how you guys talk with people in an office setting, but also, and I know both of you personally, and why I think both of you are cut from the same cloth. And what I said earlier is because I feel safe around you, both of you. And Tom, you and I've had some deep discussions. Obviously, Brian and I've had several deep discussions in group together. But there's something about you guys that gives you a feeling of safety. And Dad really brought that to the table as well. I saw that with him all the time. And I think your whole notion, Tom, as you talk about, being focused, I remember Dad's big line is he's talking with someone in the office and he's thinking to himself, of course, wow, this person really needs professional help. And this is Larry Crabb, Mr. PhD, who I always called him the Roger Federer of the counseling world. And, but to understand and the humility that both of you guys come into this with is something that I think is really attractive and freeing and makes you feel open, because you guys break all the rules of counseling, it would seem. Similar to kind of the Goodwill Hunting piece, you're telling your story and you're getting involved, and as opposed, like Brian, you mentioned, I can't pray with my client before I meet with them. It's like, hold it, that's an interesting piece, but you're probably to the point now where I want to pray with you.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Rosemead is different in their teaching now on that, but that's where we started. But that whole idea of safety and how Larry, how he modeled it, and what he taught, I think that really, one of my favorite ways that Larry would start a talk is, and I don't know if you guys remember him doing this, but the first time I heard him speak, he said, just getting up after opening in prayer, he said, is anyone else a mess like I am? He's looking for a show of hands, and I felt safe with him, and what the way Tom was talking, he's repenting to the Lord in the middle of a session. If he gets distracted or something, I'm going to be safe with a man that's doing that. And I've been taught that same way. Um, I, I used to I used to counsel out of my false self of wanting to have it together, to know what to say, to have the client leave thinking I'm a smart person or I'm a helpful person, and just you know basically um, managing an impression so I felt good. And now that's something I have to repent of, because that gets in the way of me being present to the spirit and really caring for the other person. But it's freeing to be able to just, admit that about myself, and know I need grace for that, and know there is grace for that. And then that can get out of the way. And now I'm ready to move with the spirit toward another person for their good. And I will, I, it's not a formula, but I'm much more comfortable sharing where I've sinned, where I've needed forgiveness. the mistakes and selfishness in my life with a client when it's relevant, when the spirit guides in that direction. And I think that's part of what makes us safe.
And I see both you guys, and I hear your stories. Kind of what we wanted to talk about almost for the second half of our conversation is, how do you deal with things going on in your life as you're getting ready to go into a counseling session? Because I used to think my dad had the toughest job in the world. He had to go talk to people about their problems for 8 hours and then come home and deal with me and my brother. And I thought, wow, that is so tough. I felt bad for him. But his big thing to us was always, even with New Way Ministries, and certainly what we're trying to do with Larger Story, is you got to get it in before you get it out. So when you're struggling with your wives or you've got some relational tensions, how does that impact you guys as counselors?
Yeah. Well, um, I would say early on, I used to just deny it and just kind of pretend everything was fine. And I don't think I did a very good job of self care, proper self care, in terms of taking it to the Lord in community. Now, as we've already mentioned, I'm in a group with you. I have a great context to deal with issues in our what we call our homies group, the the homies. And I'm in a Saturday morning men's group where I have an opportunity to do that as well. And our counseling group is about ten counselors besides myself, and we can be there for each other as well. I think it's just it's crazy to go through life it's just me and Jesus. Like my walk with God only involves just him and me. I think that's sin. I think it's taught against in scripture. We're supposed to assemble together. And I don't think it means just going to church and looking at the back of the head of the person in front of you. It's turning face to face, having soul talk conversations like the book talks about, and really having context where I can be real with other people about what's going on in me, and let them be Jesus to me, and vice versa. Um, that makes me a much more effective counselor. And when it comes to listening well to another person or couple, and also I'm going to counsel them to have that kind of life themselves, where they're involved in at least one community of people where they can say anything and be known and accepted for who they are. Um, it's huge, and I didn't know that for many years.
I think you put your finger on something important about church. Often, at least here in the US, we think of preaching services as going to church. We
Yeah.
don't think of relating with a community of people as that, and teaching can be a part of that, but it's that relating to one another as a body that is really what the church is called to. Um,
Yeah.
that's an important, I think, thing that gets missed a lot of times. And I think it's the reason a lot of people feel empty. They can be going to church, but it can feel empty because there's no real relating going on too often.
Yes.
So
That passage in Hebrews 10:24 and 25, um, we're used to the first part of it. Don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together. But right after it, it says, and think and consider, which means think really, really deep about how to provoke or stir one another up to love and good works.
mhm,
How we stir one another up to love and good works is not in a lecture format at church, in at
mhm,
traditional Sunday morning church. It's
mhm,
in the circle of a small group, and being real with each other in the presence of the Spirit, where we
mhm,
represent him to one another.
That was one of Dad's favorite passages, and the focus of that is the stirring up. What do we
Yes.
do now as we stir up each other? Tom, I'm interested to know, with you and Jenny. Obviously, you're not in a small group with Mom and Dad anymore. If you are, I'd like to sit in on that one with you for a while. Um,
mhm.
but but what are you guys doing for community now? I know all of us and I know all of our stories a little bit. We've all had challenges with church, and some maybe more severe than others, but nonetheless challenges. And so as we, as you were talking, Brian, and you're talking about the groups, I'm in a men's group with two other guys that are 75 years old. So I'm the junior by 20 years, and getting a chance to journey with these guys has been really interesting for me. And obviously the group with you, and I get a chance to do this with Roseanne all the time and talk with people in a deep way. But so Tom, what are you doing? What are you and Jenny doing now for community in respect to some of that kind of stuff?
Well, to put it in a context of kind of just how we think about it, it goes back to your other question is, what goes on for us when I'm working at my office, I'm coming home to be with my kids, my family, whatever it was. Probably one of the things that has struck me over the years is that I have an opportunity all day long to be in relationship with people that the Spirit kind of brings into my path. And the difficulty is that all day long and every day, I'm in different places internally. And so one of the things that I've had to get very comfortable with, and I think Jenny and this is going to lead into your question, answering your question, Cap, is that when we're around people, sometimes people, that could be my wife, my kids, my friends, clients, they could be needing $1 million from me internally. And I have maybe $20 in my pocket. That's all I have. And having learned a bit in this journey, and it's been very, very painful to learn this thing, because I'm kind of like Brian. I really, as I mentioned before, I like to be competent. So to feel the incompetency and inadequacy in myself is always a temptation to kind of try to manage the space. And what I've tried to learn to do is learn how to give my $20, how to give whatever it is that I have freely to those that are in front of me and who I'm with. And so that has been a very freeing thing relationally for us. And Jenny and I are in that place that it's not just about being in a particular community, though we do have relationships with people. We're a part of a church. But it's more of a mindset that we have that when we're ever around anybody, to try to ask the question, what is it that I have to offer and what can I give? And, it's more blessed to give than it is to receive, that very deep thought. And I go, for developing community, even in our spiritual formation group, it took a number of years. It took about 5 or 6 years to get really comfortable that we weren't measuring ourselves or over being self-conscious about what's going on inside, to really just give what we could give. And if it wasn't going anywhere, to relax with that and to get very comfortable with ourselves in a place where we're trying to actually listen to what's going on inside of us. So that's kind of how I'd respond to it, because I think it kind of fits together as far as just the whole way we look at relating. So we've got about 5 or 6 couples. We're not in a formation group, but we just have 5 or 6 couples that we're just close to. Yeah. And these are people and they're around the country that we can just talk to at any time. And we do. I don't think we'll ever be able to replicate what we had with Larry. That's just not going to happen. Okay. He brought a certain sense to that, but I think each of us that are in the group, we know that we have something to offer to the people that we relate with. And so we just try to give that. So church is a little different. We have a few people at church where the pastor and the executive pastor and some other people in the church where they are journeyers. And so they are messy people, and we can kind of relate at a messy level, which just opens all sorts of doors to really talking about our lives in really good ways. And so that's been a real encouragement for us.
I just have another thought about the link between work life and home life that you brought up, Roseanne, and how we manage. I just have a distinct impression of the Lord showing me that He wants me to be a better husband than I am a counselor. I was once pretty nervous ahead of a session. Not that that's an unusual or isolated event. Sometimes I am nervous before sessions, quite often, but just in particular, I was anxious that it went well, anxious that I got out of the way. And I prayed, I think correctly, Lord, please help me to get out of the way. You've got to, if you're not in charge of the session, nothing good is going to happen. I submit to you. I was on my knees, actually, in my closed office, praying that way before I went down the hall to greet the client. And when I put my hand on the doorknob to open my office door to go out to greet the client, as I started to open the door, the Lord impressed on my heart, Brian, why don't you pray like that on your way home?
Wow. Yeah.
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 And it was a question, actually, why don't you pray like that on your way home? Because my false self is, I want to show up as a good counselor, but I kind of take it easy at home and assume everything's going to be fine at home without that kind of energy and dependence on the Spirit. And the Lord really, in a good way, convicted me that he wants me to rely on him as much or more for how I come through the door to greet Jean than how I go through the door to greet my clients.
Well, thanks for joining us today on Relational Spirituality. And please join us next week for part 2 of our conversation, Counseling from the Other Side, a look into the mind of a counselor. And remember, we can all play a part in his larger story. Have a great week.
If you like what you heard today, hit the like button just below. Then come back by subscribing to our podcast channel. For more resources on relational spirituality, go to our website at largerstory.com.